Summer, 106 AD, the Carpathian Mountains of what is now Romania. 12,000 Roman soldiers are pushing through misty valleys and ancient forests, past burning villages and towns, still smoldering from earlier campaigns. They are not in a hurry. They do not need to be, because their destination is not going anywhere. Sarmizegetusa, the sacred capital of the Dacian kingdom, sits high in the Ordi Mountains, its stone walls rising from cliffsides, its watchtowers scanning miles of approach in every direction. It is the heart of a kingdom, and Rome has come to cut it out. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand who Decebalus was. This was not some tribal chieftain scratching survival from the dirt. Decebalus was a king who had once humiliated Rome so completely that Roman generals fled his mountain passes in disgrace. In 87 AD, he had ambushed entire Roman legions, sent survivors stumbling back across the Danube, and laughed at Roman demands for his surrender. While other kings trembled at the sound of legions marching, Decebalus raided Roman territory and dared the empire to respond. And beneath his mountains sat wealth that defied imagination. Rivers thick with gold, mountain veins rich with ore, enough treasure to fund armies for generations. He had taken that wealth and turned it into something dangerous, a unified, militarized kingdom with fortresses on every strategic peak, weapons that could punch through Roman armor, and warriors who considered dying in battle an honor rather than a tragedy. Decebalus was also something rarer than a brave fighter. He was intelligent. He studied Roman tactics, identified their weaknesses, and exploited political divisions within the empire itself. He was a king who understood that Rome had enemies it had not yet dealt with, and he made himself useful to those enemies whenever possible. For years, the humiliation of 87 AD festered in Rome like an infected wound, and eventually, the man who would lance that wound arrived on the throne. Trajan was not the kind of emperor who ruled from marble halls. Born in the province of Hispania, raised in the company of soldiers, hardened along the Rhine frontier, he was the rare leader who believed in doing the difficult thing completely rather than the easy thing halfway. He did not view Decebalus as a nuisance to be managed. He viewed him as a threat that would never stop until it was permanently stopped. So in 101 AD, Trajan unleashed the full weight of Rome on Dacia, over 10 legions, more than 50,000 men, crossed the Danube on a bridge of boats and pushed into Dacian territory through ambushes, mountain defiles, and fortress sieges that tested Roman endurance to its absolute limit. Decebalus fought brilliantly. He traded space for time, bled Roman columns in every valley, and forced Trajan to pay for every mile in blood. But Roman numbers and discipline are a tide that does not turn. By 102 AD, Roman forces had pushed close enough to Sarmizegetusa that Decebalus made the calculation every brilliant man eventually makes when the odds shift irrevocably against him. He sued for peace. The terms were brutal. Dacia would become a client kingdom. Decebalus would dismantle his fortresses, hand over his weapons and war machines, surrender his military engineers, and accept Roman garrisons in his own territory. In exchange, he kept his life and his throne. Rome called it peace. Decebalus called it time. Within 3 years, the fortresses were rising again. Weapons were flowing from hidden forges in the mountains. Dacian envoys were traveling to Rome's enemies, offering gold and promising revenge. Decebalus had never intended to honor a single word of that agreement. He had bought time, and he had used every day of it. In 105 AD, Rome's patience ended. Trajan crossed the Danube again, and this time there would be no client kingdom, no second chances, no negotiated settlement. He built a stone bridge across the Danube so permanent and so massive that it announced Rome's intention to the entire world. This was not an invasion. This was a transformation. Dacia would cease to exist as an independent kingdom, and its gold would flow into Roman coffers forever. The 106th campaign moved with methodical precision. Outlying Dacian territories fell quickly. Town after town surrendered or burned. As spring deepened, Decebalus pulled his forces back to the mountain heartland, to the fortresses that had protected his kingdom through every previous storm. The outer territories might fall, but Sarmizegetusa had never been taken, and he intended to keep it that way. The fortress was a masterpiece of defensive engineering and natural positioning. High in the Ordi Mountains, surrounded by peaks and valleys that created natural killing grounds, its stone walls rose over 20 feet thick. Watchtowers provided sight lines for miles in every direction. Natural springs inside the walls provided water. Granaries held months of food. A network of smaller fortresses created layered defensive rings that any attacker would have to break through one by one. Decebalus had chosen his ground carefully. He would let Rome stretch its supply lines through hostile mountain territory. The mountains and the coming winter would be his allies. Time itself would work against the invaders. Trajan did not give him that time. Roman scouts mapped every approach to the fortress. Engineers built roads through forests where none existed and constructed camps hardened against mountain ambushes. Siege engines were hauled through terrain that military commanders of lesser ambition would have declared impassable. By late spring, Roman camps ringed every approach to the capital. Engineers surveyed walls, calculated firing angles, and positioned siege artillery. The noose was complete. Inside Sarmizegetusa, Decebalus watched with roughly 10,000 warriors, veterans who had fought Rome before and knew exactly what was coming. Priests performed daily rituals in the mountain sanctuaries. Women and children who had fled from the lowlands crowded into the fortress seeking safety. Decebalus knew Rome's demands without needing to ask. Unconditional surrender, his head on a pike, his people enslaved or scattered, his gold shipped to Rome. He would not give them that satisfaction. The siege began in earnest in early summer. Siege towers rolled forward toward the eastern gate as catapults launched stones against battlements, and Dacian defenders answered with arrow volleys and burning oil. Roman towers, soaked in water and vinegar, resisted the fire. On the wall top, men fought in spaces barely wide enough for two soldiers side by side. Romans in locked shield formations pushed forward. Dacians with curved blades swung with the desperate strength of men protecting the last thing they had. The first assault lasted an hour before Trajan recalled his forces. Having learned what he needed to know, he had identified the weakest walls, tested Dacian numbers, and located the gates and towers most vulnerable to a second assault. 3 days later, the attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Battering rams struck the main gate. Siege towers advanced from the north and east. Scaling ladders appeared at a dozen points along the walls. The goal was simple: spread the defenders so thin that somewhere the line would break. On the northern wall, a Roman sentry reached the battlements and held a small section for 20 desperate minutes before a mass of Dacian counterattackers pushed them back into chaos. At the main gate, the ram cracked timber, but that night Dacian warriors reinforced it with stone and iron beams. The weeks that followed settled into a brutal rhythm. Roman assaults every few days, Dacian counterattacks when openings appeared, artillery duels between catapults and ballistae. men dying slowly from arrows or quickly from stones. And beneath all of it, something else was happening inside the fortress that would decide the outcome faster than any assault. Trajan's engineers had studied the terrain around Sarmizegetusa long enough to identify something critical. The springs inside the fortress were fed by underground channels that originated outside the walls. Working with the methodical patience that made Roman engineering legendary, they dug trenches, diverted streams, and collapsed tunnels over weeks of hard labor. Gradually, the water slowed. Then it slowed further. Then the cisterns began showing stone floors. Inside the fortress, rationing began. Warriors received priority. Women and children received less. The wounded received almost nothing. People licked moisture from walls. Discipline cracked under thirst in ways it had not cracked under assault. When the body fights for water, the mind stops thinking about kingdoms and gods and starts thinking about survival. Decebalus ordered harsher rationing. Priests declared that the gods would provide. The springs continued failing. By midsummer, defenders were dying of thirst faster than Roman swords were killing them. Proposals circulated among the surviving warriors. Mass breakout, negotiation, the king's personal surrender to save the others. Decebalus faced a choice no king wants to face. He opened the gates, not in surrender, but in mercy. Non-combatants, women, children, the elderly, the wounded walked out under a flag of truce, carrying white cloth toward Roman lines. Trajan let them pass. They were not his target. The kingdom, the gold, and the king were. 3,000 warriors remained. They knew what was coming. Some made peace with their gods. Others sharpened their weapons for the last time. Decebalus stood on the highest tower and looked out at Roman camps surrounding his kingdom like a closing fist. He had ruled for over 20 years. He had humiliated Rome and built a kingdom that made emperors tremble. He had fought the greatest military force in the world, and, for a time, he had won. But the legions had returned, and there was nowhere left to run that Rome would not eventually follow. He would not die on their terms. Before dawn on the day of the final assault, every Roman siege engine fired simultaneously. Stones the size of wagon wheels hammered battlements. Iron-tipped ballistic bolts punched through shields and the men behind them. 6 siege towers advanced from multiple directions as thousands of legionaries moved in tight formation behind them, and reserve cohorts waited for the breach that would end everything. Every remaining Dacian warrior stood on the walls. The wounded threw stones. Priests chanted battle prayers over the sound of siege engines. There was no hope of victory. There was only the hope of an honorable death, and the hope that Rome would pay heavily for what it was taking. On the eastern wall, the fighting was apocalyptic. Towers reached the battlements, ramps dropped, and Romans charged in shield formations into men swinging curved blades with everything they had left. Bodies piled on the wall top and soldiers fought on top of the dead. Roman discipline brought fresh cohorts forward when the previous ones tired. Dacian warriors had no relief. On the northern wall, a battering ram finally broke through a section weakened by weeks of artillery. Stone crumbled and wood splintered, and Romans poured through the gap. Trajan committed his reserves. The Dacian defensive line buckled. Then it broke. Then the fighting spread through the streets of the city itself, building by building, room by room.